And I'm going to talk about the different land uses that we find in urban areas and the different characteristics that you'll come across in those different land uses. So let's start with when you ask the question, what does an urban area look like? If you ask about a big city like New York on the left or London on the right here, a lot of people will think of this as what a city is. They'll think of big skyscrapers, lots of buildings packed in tight together. Well, this is one land use that you'd often find in the centre of cities, but it isn't the only land use. So London may have the Shard and all those big buildings like the Tower of London and the Houses of Parliament, but it also has large areas of London that are like this, residential areas that are the suburbs. So we need to realise that there are different land uses in different areas of urban areas, and we're going to talk about what they would look like in terms of characteristics. And later on, we might talk in another episode about why certain land uses in certain areas are not in others. Let's start right in the centre. This is the central business district. This is what most people think of when they think of a city. Big skyscrapers, lots of packed buildings, right in the centre, very, very busy. So some of the characteristics of the CBD include the fact is that because it's right in the centre, it's a place that people want to be to. It's a place that's high in demand. It has very, very good transport links that make it easy to access, either by big A roads, sometimes they have good public transport, but also kind of railway stations. And this is because this would where the city would have started, and so those roads have grown naturally, but it's a place that now is kind of the hub of the city. It's also an area known for having high building density, so those buildings are packed in very tight together, and tall buildings. And this reflects on something about land value. The cost of the land is very, very expensive here. Again, that's to do with the demand for it, and those transport links make it a place that is very high in demand. So rather than being able to build outwards, you have to be able to build upwards because the land is so expensive. So that's why you see in any city from Shanghai to Beijing, very, very tall buildings because the land cost is so expensive. And the kind of use of the land there, you'd find shops, commercial offices, public buildings, and very, very, very little residential. We're going to talk about how land value, and like I said, land value is very high in this area, how that might actually cause certain things like shops and offices to be there and not residential. We're going to look at that in another video. So if I look at my really basic land use model, and this is not to say every city looks like this, but it's just a generic model, we would see that the CBD right in the centre with those tall, densely packed buildings of retail and commercial. Just outside of that is the inner city. And this is the kind of an area that we might consider to be inner city. Very, very tightly packed terraced housing. So unlike the CBD, it's not going to be commercial and it's not going to be retail here. It's going to be residential, but it's going to be very, very densely packed. As you saw in that last picture, terrace housing, which at one point, when the city was, or urban area is very small, would have actually been the suburbs. It would have been the edge, but as the city has grown out around it, they are now in the inner city. And they would have been so close to the CBD because that was where the economic activity was happening, and transport would have been so poor in Victorian times that they needed to be close to be able to access the economic activity and the jobs there. Because these are often older places, we do somehow have factories and old industrial areas that, again, would have been on the edge of the city, but now have been kind of consumed by the urban growth. And because lots of deindustrialization and processes like that have happened, then you find derelict and abandoned sites, a bit like this factory here, which was once a booming part of the economy that's now been abandoned as it's either moved out of the city or to maybe another country. Because of that, we often get run down, poor quality, both housing but also the building structures here, unless the government or local council has invested, and we're seeing that happening more and more. And so you do get some of these kind of terrace housing and buildings actually being regenerated. We talked about that in the video about urban processes, how as a city develops, then in the latter stages you get urban regeneration, re-imaging and rebranding. In our urban land model, the inner city just outside the CBD, again, lots of packed housing, terrace housing and some derelict old industrial units in there as well. Outside of this, we would find the suburbs, and the density of the housing has gone down, but again it is residential. So we'll have lower density of housing and more green space, and these are going to be houses that have been built more recently. So suburbs that have been built sometimes in the last 30 or 40 years. They are going to be bigger houses and what we call semi-detached or detached housing. So semi-detached means where it's detached on kind of one side, and we've got an example there of a suburban house that's semi-detached, or detached means it's completely detached from anything else. So this shows us that there is more space, there's more green area in between, and because of that, because the suburbs are further out from the inner cities, they are actually places that still have good access to the CBD and other towns because of largely ring roads and motorways. So as technology has improved and more people have got cars, they can live further out with a bit more space and still access that CBD or still access other places through commuting. On our land urban model, where we can see the houses slightly more spaced out, lower density and more green spaces. You're also in the suburbs going to get schools and some supermarkets and services because people want them nearby, but they won't be the most dominant part of the suburbs. So the last kind of major area that we need to talk about is the rural urban fringe, and this is that boundary between the urban area that's growing out and the rural area beyond it. So again, this has slightly different characteristics to other bits of the city. It's on the edge of the city or the town, and this is that kind of area that is in the greenbelt land. So there's lots of space there. There's lots of space for expansion, and therefore that will affect the type of land use being found here. You'll get people in this rural urban fringe living in smaller kind of towns, sometimes in houses that are just outside the urban area. And again, it's because it's lots of space, you often find ring roads and motorways that link up this area, and therefore it actually has pretty good access. So because you've got more space, you get these large detached houses. We can see that in the top right hand corner there. They again are going to be even bigger than the suburban houses. They're going to have big gardens. They're going to have lots more space. So alongside this idea of the fact that we've got lots of space, and I've already said we've got kind of good access through motorways and ring roads, it's going to be very attractive to organisations that need good access and space. Retail parks, so those out of town shopping centres, science parks and warehouse centres, the kind of places when you order something from Amazon and hold them in these huge factories, they will need lots of space and good access, and they want cheap land, which they can't get in the CBD, so they're going to start pushing into these rural urban fringes. So it's an area with a variety of land uses, both residential and some kind of businesses, and it's a place that is got lots of people interested in it, so it's kind of an area that is under threat from different types of kind of stakeholders. On our model, it shows us here, as you can see, shops, bigger houses, science parks and people commuting in. And the name I'm going to give this model, it's a really simplified version. It's called a concentric zone model. There's a very similar model called the Burgess model, which separates the city into these really kind of generic rings, which most cities don't look like, but it gives you a good idea of how land use changes and how the characteristics change from the CBD going outwards to the rural urban fringe.